great having you all here to support the Historical Society. You know, there's a lot of definitions of history. The one I like is history is narratives and stories about good and evil. And I think in our lives today we hear enough stories about evil. And this is going to be a fun, good story in American history. And just for you that don't know who Charlie Russell is, he lived from 1864 to 1926. He's considered the greatest Western artist, and in his lifetime became the highest paid artist in America with no formal training. Now, every time Jim does the gift, I feel like I'm having to follow some superstar, and it makes me feel like this. Do you remember Topo Gigio? Shecky Green and Jose Jimenez from Ed Sullivan? Anyway, at least Topo got on 50 times on Ed Sullivan. Now the Beatles, Jim Cornelius, they were on 3 times. In fact, 61 years ago today, they were making their 3rd appearance. They made their first appearance in America, February 9th, 1964. These lads, in a way, were kind of like Charlie Russell because they were born during the war. They were born during World War II. And they came to America when America was grieving over John F. Kennedy that had just been assassinated in November 22nd, 1963. So, I want to dedicate this talk to Hal Bush. Hal, do you want to stand up? So Hal, I've observed him over the years. He's a passionate man. He has a passion for God, for Charlie Russell, and beating his friends at golf. And in the summer, not necessarily in that order. So here's the question. How could this pudgy little 15-year-old within a couple decades end up being the greatest Western American artist with the finest museum in Great Falls to honor any Western artist? It's quite a story. It begins for Charlie, his path to Montana begins in 1880 in March, but this is from January, and he's back in a military school in New Jersey. His parents said, "We know you want to go west, try the military school first, and if you don't like it, it's basically a reform school." Because he had dyslexia. He was a horrible student. All he wanted to do was draw and ride his horse. Well, you can see how happy he is. He had lots of demerits, about as many as George Armstrong Custer did at West Point. So this is a rare photo of Charlie at military school when he's 15. Within 3 months, he'll be in Montana. So I want to just show you, I'm going to do this talk a little differently. There's going to be a lot of fun little diversions in this talk. And I want to just show you some of the people, the celebrities in American history that wanted to be around him and called him their friend. First one is Teddy Blue Abbott. Any of you guys like Lonesome Dove? Well, without Teddy Blue Abbott, there would be no Lonesome Dove because that was based on his life. The book called We Pointed Him North. And Larry McMurtry wrote that. And he was a student with Ken Kesey at Stanford, and their professor was Wallace Stegner. So they're all together, and everybody probably knows who Ken Kesey is from Oregon. Sometimes a Great Notion, and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. So Teddy is kind of the quintessential cowboy of the American West, probably the best known of any, and he and Russell were close friends. This was actually taken in 1918 in Miles City, and if you remember from Lonesome Dove, that's where Gus died, Robert Duvall. Teddy Blue Abbott recalled in the hallowed years that the noblemen of the plains, he called the cowboy the nobleman of the plains, they were good-natured and loyal to his outfit, brave but wild, who only feared 2 things, and you can imagine what cowboys feared: a respectable woman and not having a horse. Here's Charlie on the set of The Three Musketeers. And Douglas Fairbanks is on the left, the most famous actor in the world at that time. He was married to Mary Pickford. They were a couple like Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor times 10. But they were the famous actors, and this is on the set of The Three Musketeers. Russell ended up making a bronze of him as a Three Musketeer that he gave him a year or two later. Fairbanks became the first MC of the first Academy Awards in 1928. There's Will Rogers, never met a man I didn't like, probably the most famous man in the world. He had a editorial page that he wrote for the New York Times. Tens of millions of people read it. And he became a very top famous actor before he died in 1935 in Alaska with Wiley Post. And they were really good friends. And a lot of them, people felt they looked alike. Will Rogers, a lot of you know his story, he was half Cherokee and was a big supporter of Russell and Nancy after Russell died. So there's President Harding in Butte, Montana, taking his hat off to meet Charlie Russell. And I must tell you, these photographs are rare. Like before they ended up in this book, no one knew about them. That's a Keystone stereograph. You know, back in the 1870s, 80s, every parlor in America had a little stereoscopic viewer. Jack Dempsey, Manasseh Mahler, had a world heavyweight fight in Shelby, Montana, which was a disaster. All the Montanans rushed the stands and never paid. But back then they would have the world championships in, Shelby, Montana. They didn't go to New York City or anything like that. So there's a series of photographs of Charlie and Dempsey in there. I'm going to walk over here and hopefully I won't get anybody's way, but this is Harry Carey, famous actor, and that's Harry Carey Jr. If you watch any of the cowboy movies from the 40s and 50s, Harry Carey Jr. is in a lot of them. Harry Carey taught John Wayne how to talk and how to shuffle his feet. So if you like John Wayne, without Harry Carey, no John Wayne. And there's Harry Carey and Charlie working the lassos outside of his home in Southern California. And come back over here, the great John Ford. All of you Westerners, there's John Ford with Charlie Russell and Will James, famous writer and also artist. He wrote Smokey the Cowhorse, 1926 Newbery Award winner, children's book. So Ford wins 4 Academy Awards for Best Director, another Best Director for World War II movie. So he received 5 Academy Awards. The great Dorothea Lange, the social realism photographer, migrant mother, if any of you are 30s, married to Lafayette Maynard Dixon, one of my Fab 4 Western artists. And this is at Dixon's studio at 728 Montgomery Avenue in San Francisco. And she took a series of pictures. She said she'd never been in the presence with Charlie Russell, the feeling of the spirits of an old Indian. And she said that in 1961, like 40 years after. She never forgot it. Probably the most famous female photographer of the 20th century. And of course, my boy, one of my Fab 4, Edward Curtis. Russell in 1924 goes to Biltmore Gallery after visiting Maynard Dixon in San Francisco and has his picture taken by Edward Curtis. And now we're going to segue into some photograph or some paintings. And I showed this last year. During the 1800s, there was this idea that the vanishing Indian was going away. Either physically, they were all going to be dead. By 1900, there was, a couple 100,000 Indians left out of millions, or at least culturally, they were going to be gone. Their culture would be gone. And so this is the quintessential photograph of the American West on the vanishing race. But you may not know that there's one of Russell that has a similar sentiment. And I wanted to point out before we start going through his painting some of the techniques he used. He generally put a white horse out front. That's to draw your eye. When you are visualizing a painting, watch where your eyes go. They usually are drawn to the white. And then you use the pyramidal composition, triangular, so you go down the left, down to the right. This is on the Missouri River, one of his favorite places to paint. Many of his most famous paintings were done here. It's up by Fort Benton, north of Great Falls. And a lot of folks have, this has probably been the most written about painting on the vanishing race idea. So there have been many top art critiquers and authors write about this painting. I'll just read it to you. But all detail functions in service of conveying the offhanded, nearly heartbreaking assumption on the part of the participants in this Western ideal that their world will proceed just as it is, from one sunset to another, for all time. Very sad. Here's another top writer. One need not be fluent in sign language, however, to understand the tragic principal message here. The oncoming night in Pagan is a Blackfeet, same thing, northern Montana around Glacier Park, signals the end of an ideal existence to which there is no return except in the imagination. So, I've looked at this painting for many years. It's one of my favorites, but something started not adding up about it. First off, if you guys were going to go out with a bunch of your friends on horses, would you start in the middle towards night and go into darkness? That doesn't make sense. And so I started looking around and I looked at this little boy here. Do you see on the far right there? And he's got his finger up like that. Some people have said, oh, he's pointing that way. Oh, he's not pointing, he's pointing up. In Indian Sign Language, that means yes, like 2 thumbs up. Like, hey, are you enjoying this? So who do you think this little boy is? He's Charlie's son, Jack Russell. See the hair? See that hair on his, that bang going down? Charlie had hair that was unruly, so he combed Jack's hair. Jack was 3 years old when he did this. So now things aren't adding up as far as what all the so-called critics have been writing about for 30 years. The other thing is this is on the north side of the Missouri, and the sun is coming in on the left side. This is actually a morning picture, not an evening picture. This is all full of hope. Charlie was in ecstasy in 1918 doing this painting because World War II was on. His wife Nancy, who was his business manager, had to leave him alone because there were no exhibitions to go to, so he's just hanging out with his son, having fun with this. Now this is a really interesting one. Everybody take a look at this, and I'm sure you could look at this forever and not notice this. I did for years. Look at the person behind this fellow, the one with the staff. Do you see him? That's his horse. See him right there? Do you notice anything? He doesn't have a head.
No.
What was Charlie's most favorite childhood book that he read to Jack? There's the little boy again with the signal. Whoops. The Headless Horseman. So this painting is actually a love painting to Jack that has been misdiagnosed by so-called experts all over the world for decades. You guys are the first public people to ever hear this. I gave a series on Russell to the Russell Museum and the docents, and I gave it to them a couple years ago, and you're the only public people who've ever seen this. The other thing is tribute to Edward Curtis, this ghost-like figure in the back there. It's from a Curtis photograph. In fact, I liked it so much it ended up on the American West Reimagined, the standard reference book on art of the American West. 125 of the greatest artists, all who died before 2000. It's got everybody in it, from Albert Bierstadt to Rockwell to Remington, Russell, everybody. 12 pounds. Comes with a $25 off certificate to the chiropractor. Jim, there's your painting. Little do people know that the alternative, this is Free Trapper. And free trappers were not hired by like the Missouri Fur Company or the American Fur Company. They went out and trapped beavers on their own. And an alternative title of this is Jim Cornelius delivering the nugget at 4 degrees. If you look back there, you can see the horse with nuggets in the... Right, Jim?
Yep, every word true.
I need verification on those things. So this is that's at the Montana Historical Society, which is the great state historical society of the West. This is Indian Hunter Return. This is an early one he did. Any of you know Ginger Renner? She was an authority on Russell. This was her favorite painting. Now this is a fun one. Charlie did this. It's actually a watercolor, and he gave it to the Montana Historical Society as a gift. This is York. You Lewis and Clark fans. There's Lewis and Clark over there. And what the Indians did is they took some buffalo fat or something, they rubbed it, because they'd never seen a black person. They're trying to rub the black off of him. See the little boy going up the pole? He didn't want to miss out on anything. This is the roundup from the McKay collection at the Montana Historical Society. If you guys like calf roping, you can see right there. That's the origins of calf roping and the rodeos. His most popular paintings were the buffalo hunts, even though Russell never saw a buffalo hunt. Nancy Russell said no one can be an artist without imagination, and Russell had an imagination of how the buffalo hunts should look like. The richest people, all the oil guys, and American royalty, the actors and actresses, love these paintings. That's an oil painting. This is a watercolor. He's an incredible watercolorist. This is one of his early ones. This is Big Nose George holding up the stagecoach. This was at the Mint Saloon, ended up in the Amon Carter, and now it's in a private collection. But Big Nose George was an actual person, robber between Montana and North Dakota, and he's robbing them of, some guy had gold. He got a tip, some guy had gold. Well, they got Big Nose George in Wyoming, and they hung him, and took some of his skin and made women's shoes out of it. It's called American Justice. Charlie loved Christmas, and there's Santa Claus, the reindeer. He did lots of Christmas paintings. There's really nothing he couldn't do. And this is the Iron Horse. His Blackfeet burning the Crow Range. The idea that anybody has that Native Americans were out there and just flower children having fun, they all fought each other. They had slaves. So it wasn't what it's been portrayed to be. He was an incredible landscape painter, wildlife painter, no better. I mean, anything you want painted, he could do it. This is his famous elk in Lake McDonald. If any of you have been to Glacier Park and been to Lake McDonald Lodge, it's on the right side. Charlie's Bullhead Lodge is right down here. You can see, I don't know if you can see in this photograph, but the water's falling off the elk's mouth. And these look a lot better than on the screen here. This is a fun one he did. You know, people say, oh, well, Charlie Russell hated the sheep, and he never would paint a sheep. Well, there's 2 little lambs, and it's an actual girl, and he did this for the little girl. They put a ribbon around the antelope so the hunters wouldn't shoot it. And when she was like 85, she wrote this book on Charlie Russell doing this painting for her. This is the sort of person he was. That's why he's the most loved Western artist too. So let's get to his bronzes. Many people think that his greatest talent was in sculpting. They said, when he got out to Montana, he could take clay and put it in his pocket and then bring it out of his pocket and have a bear or a horse. He had incredible, this is Meat for Wild Men, his pinnacle of his sculpting. Over 100-pound bronze, there are only 4 made, very rare. The Buffalo Hunt. Scalp Dance. Smoking to the Spirit of the Buffalo. It's actually an ashtray, so it's utilitarian. He did a bunch of ashtrays. Nancy was trying to do anything to make money, so she was... This is the Medicine Man. It's a bookend. So you buy 2 medicine men, put it together. The Bronc Twister. This is his answer to Remington's kind of stiff bronc buster. And just so you know, Remington died in 1909, and Russell didn't die until 1926. Remington died at his home of appendicitis. He'd gotten over 300 pounds, and they did surgery on his kitchen table. He didn't pay his $35 deductible. Copay. Yeah, you guys think you got medicine problems now. When the best of writers quit, or where the best of writers quit. The Range Father, Pony Chasing the Wolf, Mountain Mother. You seen okay? This was one he did with a couple months to live. It's called The Spirit of Winter, about a Blackfeet legend about a fellow that wasn't treated well in the village, and he came back with the swirling wolves around it. It's a big story, but at that point in the summer of 1926, Charlie knew he only had a couple months to live. Jim, here's the trapper. Charlie did a series of frontier types, and you can see the little beaver down there being trapped. And the beaver were about like the bison. They were both trapped to almost extermination. This is a picture writer, fabulous pen and ink drawer. He learned from Will Crawford, who lived in New York and was an illustrator. And this is an image from Backtrailing on the Old Frontier. And you can see the Indians out front. Sacagawea is meeting our friends. This is down by Lolo Pass. And he did a series of historical pen and inks. They're beautiful. This doesn't do it justice. And early on, Russell, he loved people. People loved him, and he would paint this on an envelope and then send it to people. Wouldn't you love to get one of those? Later on, he started just doing illustrated letters, and my friend Brian Dippy put a book out called Word Painter that's incredible. I think it has about 300 of his illustrated letters in it. This is one Charlie did when he was down in California. Their last 6 years, from 1920 to 1926, they spent the winters in Pasadena. And he hated cars. He never drove. There's a car there, he called them skunk wagons. Skunk wagons. And he did a lot of these where he saluted with the bottle. But he didn't drink after 1908. He also had an appendicitis and had to have surgery. He fared a little better than Remington the next year. But he loved people that drank. His favorite people were the people that owned the bars, Mint Saloon, Silver Dollar, Brunswick Bar. And they also were the big galleries because they would collect his art. And this is where ignorance is bliss. Cowboys passed out, the bears drinking his whiskey, and the horse took off. This is a series of postcards. Postcard historians know that postcards became very popular after 1900. And they did literally dozens of Russell's images on postcards. And then calendars. Calendars in every bar, every store in America had a Russell. It's called a disputed path. So Russell, kind of like the Beatles, was born during the war, Civil War, 1864. His president was Abraham Lincoln, had about a year to live when Russell was born. And the horrors of the Civil War, like the horrors of Vietnam, were never forgotten. And so I think there's kind of an analogy there. So Harvey wanted me to show him one when Charlie was a little boy. He grows up in St. Louis. His family's wealthy. He lives on a southern plantation-style home on the suburbs. He has his own horse called Jip, and he likes to ride around, and that's about all he wants to do, and think about getting out west. Well, after being in the military reform school, he headed out west, ended up in Helena, did a little sheep herding, which he didn't like. No cowboys want to herd sheep. And then this is Jake Hoover's cabin. And there's this big legend that went on for years. There's lots of legends about him that aren't true, that he was a hunter and trapper with Jake Hoover and all that. He was more like a house mom, stayed home at the cabin while Jake went out. But here's Charlie back trailing on the old frontier, when he's an older man, down in the Judith Basin, west of Utica. Gorgeous area. So here's 1884. Charlie's part of the cowboy. This is the Judith Roundup. There's Charlie. These are his boys that he never forgets. You know, a famous quote is, study a man when he's 20 and you'll know his mind. So there's Charlie, and that definitely pertains to him. This is his first formal cowboy picture. The cowboys would be out on the range and they'd put on their best outfits, then go into town. Kind of like Curtis did with the Native Americans, the Sunday best. And you saw how Russell crossed his arms. All the photographers mimicked Matthew Brady. There's Custer during the Civil War, probably the top celebrated person of the Civil War. And then the famous winter of 86 and 87, waiting for a Chinook, or the last of 5,000. They had got into taking cattle from Texas to Montana, like in Lonesome Dove. And it was usually all the rich guys that didn't live there owned them. And then they had this winter where a lot of them got killed. The cattle just weren't used to a Montana winter. And it was a big kill off. And after that, they barbed wired, and the days of the open range were over with. This is what Russell looked like right about the time he did Waiting for a Chinook. Again, look how close the pose is. That's Libby Custer, who, kind of like Nancy Russell, was a huge supporter of Custer after he died. This is Charlie's first artist picture, 1893. He finally gives up the cowboy life. He was a night hawk, which meant he watched the horses at night, and then the cowboys went out during the day. So he wasn't much of a cowboy. And then he meets Nancy Russell, that changed everything. Without Nancy, no Charlie. And it's 1896. Again, this is rare photographs. She was a poor girl from Kentucky, ended up in Helena with her mom. Stepfather takes off with a stepdaughter, and Nancy's left in Helena taking care of a mother with tuberculosis that's coughing up blood for about 4 or 5 months before she dies. This is a Roland Reed photograph of her in 1920 at the Brown Hotel in Denver. I don't know if any of you have heard of Roland Reed, but he was another pictorialist like Edward Curtis. And this is Russell, call this his angle of repose, Wallace Stegner. And 1900, does a cowboy picture get any better than that? Very photogenic. This is Sid Willis on the right, just to say again how much the bar owners were his friends and patrons. And Sid Willis had a huge collection, the mint collection, that ended up at the Amon Carter Museum in Fort Worth. So a lot of the famous paintings ended up there. So Russell's, look at his hair there. See that funny haircut on the right? He had this cowlick that was, he became so famous, they put him on the cigar boxes too. 1903, they built the log cabin studio, which is still there on the complex of the Russell Museum. If you haven't been to the Russell Museum, it's now an entire block complex. They've had his home, the museum, and his studio. Essentially every painting he ever did, he finished in that little studio there. It's a great meeting place too for all his buddies. That same year, 1903, he goes to New York, meets all the artists, illustrators. There may be a brief meeting with Remington. Here they are in a hotel room, Charlie showing his paintings, and he's kind of doing some sculpting, and Nancy, the studious, scholarly one's reading a book. The friends, his cowboy friends, did not like Nancy. And a lot of stories were made up about her that weren't true. But, in that period, women didn't vote, and any woman that was assertive, smart, that was very intimidating for men. And she was all of those, and was a better business person than any of the oil guys or the movie stars. 1906, they build Bullhead Lodge on Lake McDonald, and that basically every summer they would spend there. And tons of people, very famous people, would come there to visit him. Beautiful spot, it's still there. One of the most famous artists was Philip R. Goodwin. Jim, I think you said that's one of your favorites. He's one of my favorites. And here's Charlie on the right and Phil on the left dressing up as Indians at Bullhead Lodge. He's one of my Fab Four, Phil. This is the sort of stuff Phil did. He did Jack London's Call of the Wild in 1903. He did Teddy Roosevelt's African Game Trails in 1909. And the famous horse and rider logo that's on ammunition, Winchester. You go to any hardware store, my dad had it in his hardware store. Ubiquitous until probably the Nike swoosh logo. You know, probably the biggest trademark in American history. So here's his big one, Indian meeting Lewis and Clark at Ross Hole. Most painters in that period, the white painters, would always have the white people discovering the Indians. Charlie reversed it. The Indians were discovering Lewis and Clark off to the right. Again, notice the white horse up front. And almost everyone I've shown you, there's a white horse up front. I could go white horse, pyramidal. It was just standard. This painting is 12 feet by 25 feet. And he did it in his log cabin. Can you imagine trying to do the perspective on that? His log cabin is about not as wide as this room. It was small. And he actually raised the roof of his cabin, and he never did like it as much after that. But if you go to Helena and go to the Capitol building, this is in the House of Representatives on the right. On the far left is the governor's office, where you Yellowstone fans, that's where they're always going into the governor's office. This is a fun one too that has never been known before. Russell painted himself into this painting. There's Russell in his log cabin studio. And that person right there is him. And there he is. There's Charlie, right there. That little story is actually in the book. When the land belonged to God, this is also in the Capitol building. Many consider it his greatest painting. I didn't put in a color painting of it, but these are buffalo crossing the Missouri River. You know, and the story is how many bison were there in the West. You know, I've heard from 10 to 20 to 50 to 60 million, people being very authoritative. The bottom line is no one really knows how many buffalo were there. I'm sure it was in the millions. I can tell you this, it's the largest extermination of wildlife in world history. To take tens of millions of bison and take them down to a few hundred in 20 years is quite a feat. And that was Russell's logo cipher. He puts the little buffalo skull. There's Charlie again, hanging out in 1918. World War I's on, and he's having the time of his life with Jack, his little 3-year-old son. I put this in here just to let you know that he did write some books, Trails Plowed Under, Backtrailing on the Old Frontier, Rawhide Rollins, More Rawhide. And a lot of folks like his stories, the old cowboy stories. 1926, he's at Bullhead Lodge. It's his last summer there. He has a huge goiter. And I don't know if you folks know what a goiter is. It's not so common now. It's an enlarged thyroid gland. And back in the days before 1925, a doctor in Cleveland figured out how to put iodine in salt, iodized salt, but Russell didn't have that benefit. So people that didn't get iodine, especially the northern tier states, would get goiters, and it would enlarge. And this one was enlarging, and it was cutting off his throat. So he went to the Mayo Clinic in July 1926, and they cut his goiter out. And then, as you can see, he doesn't look great right here. Another interesting thing, just as a side note, back in those days, formal shirts didn't come with collars. The arrow shirts, you would buy the collar depending on how high you want the collar. And of course, Nancy wanted that collar real high on Charlie because she didn't want anybody to see his goiter. I think this is after the surgery, so he probably couldn't use a tight one. He dies in October. One of the problems, this is just a medical thing, is when you cut out a goiter and you don't replace it with iodine, you've totally destroyed a person's ability to get any iodine. So actually the surgery they did at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, probably perpetuated or made his demise sooner. He had coronary artery disease. He was a heavy smoker. But I think that thyroid surgery, it had to happen, but it probably killed him sooner. And there his grave in Great Falls. And there's young boy. Indians loved him. And Trails Inn in Pasadena. I've actually been there, still there. Nancy was building that when Charlie died. And to show you how driven she was, he dies in October, and she's the one that put on all the shows, the West that has passed shows all over the country, and England and France. He dies in late October. She's having a show in January. I mean, and she relied heavily on his bronzes. The nice thing about his bronzes is they could be reproduced, and so it provided her with income. The problem with the Russell bronzes today is there's tens of thousands of fakes and ones that aren't worth anything. And I mean, you can buy them at Costco and get on eBay. Millions of them. So Russell dies in October 1926. The question is, who is the only artist in Statuary Hall in Washington, D.C.? American artist, Charlie Russell. In fact, when you watch some of these politicians there, they often interview them in front of Charlie Russell. It's amazing how often that is. So thank you for supporting the Three Sisters Historical Society. Appreciate you all coming. Charlie does too, and his Indian friends. And now little Topo Gigio will hand it back to the Beatles. I think Jim said he's going to finish with a song. Thank you.